For the last two slides, I want to quickly go over some irregular forms. And for these, I already wrote out the forms in the paradigm boxes for you. And what I want you to do for this is to really just kind of watch and observe with me some of the changes. So far, we talked about regular aorists like luo. And then we talked about stops like blepo. And other stop verbs where there's one tweak that you have to remember whenever you use the aorist form for stop verbs, and that's the square stops. Then we talked about verbs that require two tweaks, and those are the liquids, where they use a modified tense formative, and possibly there might be a slight change in the stem of the word, like apostello. And now we're going to go over irregular verbs and just some examples. And a lot of times the irregular verbs have an unexpected form because its verbal root is really different or has more than one verbal root. So either you have an unexpected verbal root or it has more than one. So let's look at these two examples. Thelo. Notice that even though thelo is a lexical form, its true verbal root looks like this. And so one of the things, it actually has a short vowel as part of its verbal root stem, and it begins actually with an epsilon. So even though we see thel as the stem for the lexical form, it's ethele as the stem for the verbal root. So when we see the first aorist form, thelo meaning I wish, I will. So this is I wished, I willed, I wanted. This is your augment. It's an eta because the verbal root begins with an epsilon. And then because the stem of the verbal root actually has a short vowel, you have compensatory lengthening. So a thelesa is the form for I wished, I wanted. For kaleo, remember that we talked about this as a fake contract verb. It acts like a contract verb only in the present and the imperfect tense because the lexical form includes that short vowel. But the verbal root uses a classical letter, the digamma, as part of its stem. And so what happens is that when you turn it into a aorist form, it adds the augment as you would expect, but notice that there's no compensatory lengthening because really what happens is the digamma stabilizes the short letter, and so it will not go long. So akalesa is not a typo, but this is I called. And those are just two examples where the form is irregular in the aorist tense because the verbal root is something you don't expect. The other type of irregular verbs often have more than one verbal root. And depending on what tense you're looking at, the verbal root that is used will be different for each tense. So, for example, erkamai, its verbal root or stem, erk, is used for the present tense forms, but it uses aluth for the future forms, and it uses a form of aluth for the second aorist forms. What happens is that you have aluth here. Remember, erkamai means I am coming, I'm going. So with aluth, for some reason, this diphthong drops, and then when you augment the epsilon, it becomes an eta. And then it uses the second aorist forms, not the first aorist forms. And so to say I went, I came, you use the word aelthon. Now, many of the double or triple, sometimes, verbal roots for one verb do like using the second aorist forms. And so what you have here on this chart, let me clear this up a little bit, is that just simply review. These are verbs you already know: gitamai, erkamai, echo, lego, horao, ginosko, pino. Pino, I think, is actually a new vocabulary. And here are the verbal roots. And these are verbs that use the second aorist forms. And so I wrote out the second aorist forms for you on the chart. And this is simply a way for you to review. And that concludes our module on the aorist indicatives.